Chapter 1 The Last Relative. Most people who made their way to Detective's Row were in trouble one way or another, and Toby Montrose was in a heap of it. He had been living with his Uncle Gabriel for only 2 months, but trouble had always been good at finding Toby. This time it had tracked him down more quickly than ever. Currently, the trouble's name was Miss Arthur Abbott. She sat across from Toby in the one good chair Uncle Gabriel reserved for clients. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said to Miss Arthur Abbott. "I don't understand what you're asking me to do." Miss Arthur Abbott picked up the cup of tea Toby had brought her. She frowned at it. Then she frowned at the damp ring it had left on the dusty tabletop. "I want you," Miss Arthur Abbott repeated, "to tell me why I have paid you this visit." Her words didn't make any more sense to Toby the second time he heard them. Somewhere in the walls, behind the peeling flowered paper and the pictures yellowing in their frames, a mouse scampered past. Toby hoped Miss Arthur Abbott wouldn't notice the noise. "I don't mean to be rude," he said, "but wouldn't it be easier for you to explain to me why you're here?" Miss Arthur Abbott set down her cup without drinking from it. Her gold bracelets clacked together on her wrist. "You are a detective, are you not?" "Yes, ma'am. Strictly speaking, Toby was only a detective's assistant." But he didn't think Miss Arthur Abbott would like the sound of that. "Then detect, deduce, study my person, the splatter of mud on my shoe, perhaps, or the faint scar above my left ear, and tell me what troubles have caused me to seek a detective's assistance." Miss Arthur Abbott leaned forward and Toby leaned away. The legs of his ancient chair creaked dangerously under him. "I've read my fair share of stories in the Sphinx Monthly Reader, young man, and I know how these things work. Hugh Abernethy is always able to determine his clients' problems a good 5 minutes before they open their mouths. I'm sure and halfway decent I'm sure any halfway decent investigator can do the same." Her eyes narrowed. "Or aren't you halfway decent?" "I've read the Sphinx too, ma'am," Toby said quickly. He hated to admit it under Uncle Gabriel's roof, but at least Uncle Gabriel himself wasn't home to hear the confession. He'd asked Toby to watch the office for him while he went into town, and he'd given Toby the usual jumble of old case records to organize. But he hadn't said a word about what to do if a new client came to visit. "Won't you wait for my uncle to come home?" There was that small panicked voice again, sneaking out of Toby before he could fix it. "I'm sure he'll be able to help you. He's one of the best detectives on the road." And the mouse chose this moment to fall on Miss Arthur Abbott's head. With a shriek, Miss Arthur Abbott jumped to her feet. Tables overturned, and knickknacks crashed to the floor as she tore through the parlor, swatting at her hair. One wild swipe of her hand knocked over the stack of case files that Toby had spent all morning putting in order. The mouse, which seemed to sense that it was in danger of becoming a murder victim, darted down her neck and slipped inside one of her capacious sleeves. Toby jumped up, too. "I'm sorry," he said for the third time. He batched at the part of Miss Arthur Abbott's sleeve where he thought the mouse might be, but this only made her shriek more loudly. Toby was surprised. Half of Detectives Row didn't come running in hopes of finding a convenient crime in progress. Eventually, Miss Arthur Abbott's shriek turned into words. This, she sputtered, is a sorry excuse for a detective agency. She flung her arms wide. The mouse sailed out of her sleeve and across the room where it took refuge behind one of Uncle Gabriel's file cabinets. Toby wished he could do the same. And you, boy, are a very sorry excuse for a detective. Miss Otter Abbott pulled on her long black coat and squashed her hat down on her head. I don't know why your uncle bothers to employ you, but rest assured he'll be receiving a lengthy complaint from me, along with a bill for a new gown. I can't imagine wearing this one again after it's been so thoroughly moused. The trouble had really outdone itself this time. How many more crimes would Uncle Gabriel have to solve before he'd made enough money to pay for Miss Arthur Abbott's new dress? Hundreds, probably. Thank you for visiting Montero's investigations, Toby said miserably, wishing he hadn't promised to be polite. Miss Arthur Abbott, who must not have made a similar promise, scowled at him and slammed the front door behind her, leaving Toby alone to start cleaning up the mess. Until the year he turned 8, nothing very terrible had ever happened to Toby. He'd grown up in a stout white farmhouse where sunlight poured through the curtains his mother had sewn, and the old floorboards creaked with his parents' comfortable footsteps. On his 8th birthday, the whole family, all three of them, had walked to the river bank for a picnic. Nothing went the way they'd planned. Toby's mother dropped the cake in the grass, and his father tripped and fell into the river. And a rainstorm swooped in from the west, washing away the lumpy frosting and making them all as damp as Toby's father. It should have been a disaster, but Toby's mother draped the picnic blanket over a branch to make a sort of tent. Toby's father sliced the sodden cake, and they all sat in the grass, licking crumbs from their fingers and almost bursting. Then Toby's parents had left for a trip to the seashore, and Toby himself had been sent to stay for a week with his Aunt Janet. Aunt Janet had 6 children of her own, whom she murdered with military precision. She administered a kiss to Toby's cheek each morning after checking his fingernails for dirt. Toby had never heard her laugh. She had, however, cried exactly once when the police officer from the seashore came to the door to tell her there had been an accident. Toby hardly remembered the funeral. There had been eye-dabbing ladies in drab gowns and nose-blowing gentlemen in suits. He knew some of them, but they'd floated around him in a thick black cloud, murmuring sad words he couldn't make out. Since the rowboat his parents had disappeared in had never been found, there hadn't even been any caskets at the front of the church. The only thing that had seemed real to Toby was the trouble. It wrapped itself around him for the very first time, filling his ears like cotton wool, so he could hardly hear Aunt Janet saying she would take care of him from now on. The trouble, however, had other plans in mind. After a few months of daily fingernail inspections, Aunt Janet determined that she couldn't afford to care for a 7th child, particularly one who tracked mud across her carpets and often forgot to scrub behind his ears. It's fortunate your parents had so many relations, she told Toby as she handed him off to Uncle Francis, who managed the fancy hotel. Otherwise, poor dear, you'd have to be sent to an orphanage. The thought of being crammed into a cold, smelly bunk room with dozens of other miserable little boys turned Toby's insides to jelly. A small piece of him still hoped that disappearing into a rowboat was just kind of disaster his parents could fix, and that they'd turn up one day to collect him and bring him home. When this didn't happen, however, he decided to be so well behaved and useful that Uncle Francis would have no choice but to keep him. It didn't work. Toby tried to help in the hotel restaurant, but when he spilled an entire bottle of expensive wine all over a loud and short tempered Duke, Uncle Francis hurried Toby along to Aunt Ingrid, who owned the bakery. When he fell asleep at the oven and burned the morning bread loaves, Aunt Ingrid sent him to Cousin Celeste at the hospital. And when Cousin Celeste couldn't find the money to pay for the clothes Toby was constantly growing out of, she sent him to Uncle Howard at the stables. In this way, Toby was passed around the family like a bowl of cold mashed potatoes at dinner, until the day 3 years later when ancient grandfather Montrose unfolded his newspaper, took one last wheezing breath, and passed away right in the middle of the society pages. The housemaid shrieked and sent for Aunt Janet. It's a shame, Aunt Janet had said as she packed Toby's few belongings into his suitcase. But we can't avoid it any longer. You'll have the detective, Toby had asked. He was as fond of detective stories as everyone else in the city of Coleridge, and the outside pocket of his suitcase was stuffed with his parents' old copies of the Sphinx Monthly Reader. Living on Detectives Row sounded 100 times more interesting than pouring Grandfather Montrose's medicine, and Toby said to Aunt Janet. Aunt Janet had wrinkled her nose as if she'd smelled something stale. Gabriel, she said, is not a good influence. He spends his time rummaging through morgues and lurking in alleys. And as far as his reputation, well, the less said about that, the better. He's not fit to take care of a young boy, and I doubt he can afford to keep you on for more than a few months. But neither can the rest of us. She'd snapped the suitcase shut and placed it in Toby's hands. Be good for your uncle, Toby, she told him, and for heaven's sakes, don't give him any reason to turn you away. He's your last relative, you know. That was why Toby had to be clean and polite, and why he couldn't possibly disappoint Uncle Gabriel, no matter what kind of influence he was. Toby had learned enough about his family to know by now that if Uncle Gabriel couldn't afford to keep him, or worse, if Uncle Gabriel didn't want to keep him, he'd be sent to the orphanage, and that would be that. Toby was still sweeping pieces of knick-knack into the dustpan when Uncle Gabriel returned. "Good news, Tobias," he said as he stomped inside. His enormous voice was slightly muffled, for once, by the pile of brown paper wrapped parcels in his arms. "The butcher had a handsome stewing hen he needed to part with, so I took it off his hands. I'll place it straight into Miss Satterthwaite's stew pot, and we'll all feast like kings for the rest of the week. Except for Miss Satterthwaite, that is. I expect she'll feast like a queen." As his uncle tittered into the kitchen with his stack of parcels, Toby hid the dustpan behind his back. He was pretty sure most actual kings and queens would turn up their royal noses at Uncle Gabriel's cook's chicken soup, but he wasn't about to do the same. He didn't even mind the rubbery carrots. They probably didn't have any carrots at all at the orphanage. "So, Tobias," said Uncle Gabriel, coming back into the hall, "did you solve any crimes while I was away?" He said this every time he left Toby in charge of the agency, and then he would let out a boom of laughter, and Toby would laugh too. This time, though, Toby couldn't even manage a chuckle. He had to tell Uncle Gabriel about Miss Arthur Abbott's silk dress and all the rest of it. But the truth
was bound to make Uncle Gabriel upset, and Toby didn't know where to begin. I tried to solve the crime, sir, he said. I swear I did, but I don't know much about motor cars, and I couldn't.
They stopped Uncle Gabriel's laughter in a hurry. He looked around the parlor at the crooked drapes Toby had tried to tuck into place, and at the files he'd hurriedly stacked. He peered at the dustpan behind Toby's back, then he frowned and ran his finger over the bristles of his beard. I can see that something unusual has taken place in this room, he said. But as a professional investigator, I find it hard to believe that a well-dressed rodent could have caused quite such so much destruction. As much as I'd enjoyed deducing the true course of events, it would probably consume most of the evening, and Miss Satterthwaite sinks into a gloom when I pay more attention to my work than I do to her dinner. You'd better tell me exactly what happened. He lowered himself into a chair which creaked even more under his weight than it had under Toby's, and pulled out the small blank book he carried with him to crime scenes. The mouse was driving a motor car, you say? Not the mouse, sir, said Toby. Miss Otter Abbott. Only she wasn't driving a motor car. That was exactly the problem. In a rush, Toby told his uncle as much as he could bear to confess. Uncle Gabriel scratched away in his notebook, interrupting Toby every so often to ask a question about the soles of Miss Otter Abbott's shoes or the precise species of the mouse. By the time Toby had finished speaking, his mouth was dry. Uncle Gabriel set his notes aside, and Toby tried to read them upside down to see if any of them said orphanage.
There's one more thing I'd like to know, Tobias. Uncle Gabriel folded his hands together, looking grave. When Miss Otter Abbott stormed out of our home, where did she go? Toby wished he hadn't asked. To Mr. Abernathy's, he said as quietly as he could. I'm sorry to say the name, sir. I know you don't like hearing it. Mr. Abernathy, said Uncle Gabriel. That puffed up, self serving old ostrich. There'll be no chance of getting the woman's business back now. And I don't suppose she'll be recommending Montrose investigations to any of her wealthy friends. He slumped down in his chair and shrugged. Truthfully, she sounds like an awful nuisance. I would have liked to get acquainted with her money, but I don't envy Hugh Gabinetty for having to tolerate her company. Toby thought there were plenty of reasons to envy Hugh Abernathy, but the idea of seeing Miss Otter Abbott again, even for a moment, made him feel queasy. She wants us to pay for the dress that got ruined, he admitted. She said she'd be sending you a letter about it. The peach silk, Uncle Gabriel sighed. I suppose it cost a fortune. Of course it did. The woman's got her own motor car. He squinted at Toby. You don't happen to have any cash reserves hidden under your mattresses, do you? Any gemstones scattered in the back lawn? Toby squirmed. I was hoping you did. I, said Uncle Gabriel, haven't had a new case in weeks. I'm not the only one, either. Miss Price next door says business is as bad as she's ever seen it. There are too many detectives in this town, Tobias, and there's not enough crime to put food on all of our tables, or silk dresses on all of our backs, for that matter. If something doesn't change soon, we'll all be boarding up our windows by the end of the year, and Mr. Abernathy will have the whole row to himself. He pressed his fingers to his brow as though he felt a headache coming in. Maybe I can persuade Miss Satterthwaite to make us a loan. Do you think she might secretly be a duchess? Probably not, Toby said glumly. He didn't think secret duchesses usually found work as part-time cooks. and he was sure Miss Satterthwaite couldn't afford even one sleeve of a silk gown on the meager paycheck they gave her every month. "This is all my fault, sir. If I could only do something to fix it." He hadn't even finished his sentence before Uncle Gabriel started shaking his head. "My business troubles have nothing to do with you, Tobias, and I shouldn't have brought them up. Forget I said the word. 11-year-old boys shouldn't be worrying about money. And while we're at it, they certainly shouldn't be calling me sir. Do you understand?" Toby nodded. He wondered what 11-year-old boys should be worrying about. But this didn't seem like the right moment to ask. He didn't want Uncle Gabriel to call him an ostrich. The clock on the mantel struck 5, accompanied by a symphony of sharp knocks at the door. Miss Satterthwaite, prompt as usual, Uncle Gabriel stood up to let her in. Halfway across the hall, however, he paused. "There is one thing you can do," he said, turning back to Toby. "The next time any clients show up, when you're here alone, why don't you ask them to have a seat and wait until I return? That's all a detective's assistant really needs to do." So much for not disappointing Uncle Gabriel. "Yes, sir," said Toby. Well, yes. "Excellent," said Uncle Gabriel. The symphony of knocks had progressed into its next movement, much more energetic than the first. "Now, Tobias, let's banish all thoughts of detection from our minds and think only of the mystery of tonight's dinner."